What's going on? What's going on? I want to introduce you guys a good friend of mine named Carlos Pasillas. We met in South Padre Island, and I always joke around because the first time we met, him and I did not have a place to stay. We were at an event, and whoever put the event together didn't have a place for him and I to stay, so it ended up being like 4 or 5 of us in a bedroom at a hotel. And it was just funny. I always said, my first time meeting Carlos was in a hotel, and we spent the night together. Anyway, that's always my joke. Carlos, I want to thank you for joining.
Well, hey, Jimmy, thank you again, man. This is an awesome opportunity that you have to talk to so many people. I think one of the things that most of us, if not all of us, have a story to tell about our fathers. I wanted to share with you my experience as a father. So let me just give you a recap of who I am. I've been married for almost 18 years to my wife, and we have 2 wonderful boys. And my oldest, his name is Alexander Elian. And then my youngest is Tiago Nicolas. I still remember the moment my firstborn was born. It was 6:26 in the morning that day on April 14th. I remember that time because I felt like this is my opportunity. I had a father. My father passed away last year, January.
Sorry to hear that.
January 24. Yeah, thanks, man. Like most fathers, he was a Hispanic father, so he didn't have a good example. And unfortunately, he did a lot of mistakes that now, as a father, that's the thing that I wanted to share with you. Just how can we be fathers when we ourselves weren't really fathered? We weren't really, helped in that way. So that's the thing that I feel a burden for, because I have 2 boys, and just seeing them every day grow up, it's just a miracle. It's an amazing experience.
I thank you for sharing that. When you first mentioned the topic of fatherhood, I immediately thought about myself. My mother had me at 15, and I wasn't raised with my biological father. I think my mother and my father separated once I was 3 years old. My mother then gets remarried to who I call dad. I call him Papi, when I was 6 years old, I believe, 5, 6, 7 years old. And unfortunately, him and I didn't have a good relationship. As I got older, I'm married now. I got 3 girls. I look back, and honestly, I thank God every day that he was in my life. One of the things that I used to be angry towards him about was that he was really good with cars. He was a handyman. Because we didn't get along, it was like I never learned anything from him in that aspect. I never learned how to be a handyman. And now I'm like, man, I wish I would have learned some stuff. So that was one thing I was upset about. But the truth of the matter was that he was never physically abusive. He was never verbally abusive or sexually abusive. And I thank God for that. But he was raised in a home where he didn't have his pops around. And I remember one day, we could kind of unpack this. I asked him, so I have a sister. She's 7 years old, younger than me. And he was very dry with me and my sister. He would work hard. He would come home. He was tired. Didn't show emotions. But I noticed that when we were in church, the kids loved him because he was a different person in church.
Yeah.
And one day, me and him were having the discussion, and he's like, well, you got to understand, I was raised a certain way. And I said, I get that. I completely get that. This time, I'm already a teenager. I said, cool, I get that. Because my issue was like, why don't you at least try for her, your blood daughter, And he said, well, I was raised this way. And he expressed himself. And I told him, well, why is it that you could fake it in church with other children? And I said, maybe you should also fake it at home. It would be much better. And I know that when I said as a teenager, there was a lot of anger towards me, and I probably didn't say it in a respectful way. Fast forward years later, me and him sat down. I'm married now with my kids. He apologized, and he told me that there's one thing that I told him that really hit him hard. He said, I remember the day that you told me, Papi, there's one thing that you've taught me is what kind of husband not to be and what kind of father not to be. And he said, I remember the day you told me that, it broke me. Shortly after that, I moved out of the house. So I want to ask you, growing up, how was it with your father? Was your father a father who was affectionate? What are some things that you loved about your father? What are some things that you wish your father would have done differently?
Yeah. Man, when you're telling me your story, man, it sounds like I'm hearing my own. So just real quick, my mother married my stepfather when I was 3. And, I didn't know my biological father, and that's another whole podcast. But growing up, as a kid, I don't remember this, but they would say that he would like watch cartoons with me, he'd play cards with me. But as I got older, like his affection to me drew farther and farther away.
Mm.
He was never disrespectful, but he was never involved. And the one thing that I clearly remember, I was in high school and I was playing basketball, and I remember doing a foul shot. So I was on the line, and I turned and I remember seeing, like, I can see it, I can see all the people cheering, and I can see my mom cheering. And right next to my mom was a space.
Mm.
And for me, that impacted me as a teen and as a father now, that I never want to miss those opportunities with
Wow.
my kid. My dad never went to any of my basketball games. He would go to a couple of my football games, but because they were like on the weekends, but anything that was from, Monday through Friday, he was never around. So I think that, growing up, I had to cope with that. And then fast forward to now being a grandfather of my kids, it didn't help that, he wasn't as affectionate with my kids as he was with
Mm.
his grandkids out there in California. For me, I'm the type of person that I try to hold on to the good memories, but at the same time, each picture has a shadow, and I can think of all the things that my dad didn't do, like you were saying. And the one thing that I remember the most about my dad was like this guy was super like involved in church, gave Bible studies,
Mm.
from which I think that that's where I got my passion for helping and ministering to people. But when it came to us as a family, like he didn't know, like, even, we got used to that half a hug, like if
Mm.
he hugged you, it was a half a hug, he never called me like anything other than hey kid, like it was never affectionate. And yeah, my mom used to say, well, that's how he grew up and that's how he was and that's how his grandfather was. And I used to always say, but why does he have to be that way?
Wow.
I understand my grandfather was that. And so for me, having my dad in the background really challenges me to not be like that, and every so often I'll get the occasional, well, you're just like your dad from my wife.
Wow.
And that really pulls me to be like, okay, whatever I'm doing, I need to stop and I need to come back to where I promised myself I would never be.
Do you ever remember your father pulling you aside and say, "Hey, Carlos, just want to let you know I love you"?
No, never, ever.
It's
No.
it's funny you said it because when I found out that my wife was pregnant, I remember being upset. We had been married 3 years, and I was upset that she was pregnant. Why? I think it was just shock, but immediately it hit me. Am I going to be what my stepdad was to me?
Mm,
And as much as I was like reclamaba, I would call him out on it. I was still kind of afraid, will I do that? Because I'll never do that. But then I
mhm,
realized easier said than done. And I was so scared. And I always say I'm glad I got 3 girls because I tend to be more sensitive with them. Because sometimes I'll
mm,
do things, I'm like, man, these are boys. It'd probably be different. I know you got 2 boys, but I said it would be different. I remember somebody really close to me once told me that her and her father weren't that close growing up. She goes, they got to the point that I loved him because he was my dad, but I hated him. He had done and
mm,
said some things that she was just so angry at him, and he had called her names because a boy called the house, and it was
mm,
extreme calling of names, and she's like, literally nothing happened, and he went full blown in front of everybody. And she's like, so I had a lot of anger towards my dad, but I never spoke to him about it because he knew and he just didn't care. But once she had children, she tells me, once I had children, the way he acted towards her children, her kids, it made her forgive him and actually love
mhm,
her father again. So it's funny that you said, hey, I was going to ask you, well, what about with with his grandkids, which would be your children? It's almost like you get a second chance when you fail as a father. Like my
mm,
stepdad, we're not as close as maybe we could have been, but I got a lot of respect for him. I call him for Father's Day. But the truth is, it doesn't come out natural. So
mhm,
much that I was a member of the same church that he was a member of, just because they had a really good kids program in Arlington. And one day they asked me to speak at church. And when I went to
mhm,
speak, I introduced myself. They knew me as the member of the church. And I said, maybe most of you guys may or may not know, but my dad is so and so. Nobody knew in the church that's your dad, and
Mm,
it wasn't because we looked different because he's my stepdad. No, it was about we had no idea. That was kind of the we just even at church it was kind of the side hug. I do tell him because I'm naturally very affectionate. So I always say I love you. But the truth is, I do love him. But whenever I'm on the phone and I hang up, the part I hate to say is like, okay, I love you, Papi. And you could tell he's like, love you. It's almost it's almost like we're doing it because we have to, even though we've
yeah.
never talked about it. So let me ask you this: you mentioned your dad passed away. If you don't mind me asking, was there something that you guys knew was coming? And the reason I'm asking, because the next follow up question is, was there time for your father and you to maybe talk about these things?
No, yeah, no. So my dad died January 24, 2021, and his passing was so sudden. I spoke to him that Friday, and he went to church on Saturday, and then Saturday afternoon he hung out with my brothers. And Saturday night I had a wedding, so I did a wedding for a couple that was at our church. And I got home late, and I was just tired, so I put my phone in the kitchen and did my thing, and then I went to bed. Well, the next morning, my wife goes to the kitchen, and then that's when my son, that's no, I'm sorry. So he goes into the kitchen. My son goes into the kitchen, not my wife, and he sees my phone had like 100 messages, and my oldest son yells out, "Dad, Dad, Grandpa just died!"
Whoa.
And and of course, we were still in bed, and my wife screams, and I'm screaming, and I'm like, "What's going on?" I guess my dad, he had been having some heart issues the week prior of his passing, but like typical men, he didn't want to go to the doctor. He thought it would be fine. And so Saturday night, well, early Sunday morning, he had a massive heart attack and he passed away.
Mm,
For me, that has been an experience that um, has been hard. I'll be honest with you, because no, there was no closure.
mm,
Doing his service, hearing so many people talk so well about him, it's hard. It's hard to put the picture to the man. It's hard to put what people say about him and what I experienced with him. This is a guy that would come home from work and he would eat dinner, leave his plate on the table, go and sit down, turn on the TV and fall asleep. That was his routine
mm,
every single night. Um, and so for me, I had to juggle with that, and so for my dad and I, the one thing that how you have a special conversation with your parent, with your father. In some cases, it's sports or it's music or it's whatever, the politics. For my dad and I, it was church. So, if I was having issues at the church, I'd call him. He'd give me like like a one-word response on how to fix the problem. And so, that was the time that I could connect with him. But we can never talk beyond that. So the
mm,
conversation would end, literally like end the moment I changed the subject. Prior to that, my mom had a brain aneurysm, actually October 4th of 2019. So my dad was just, I mean, he was under a lot of stress, and just all kinds of things happened these last 3 years. Just time didn't allow for us to really put that in. And I say this now as I look back, that I have to forgive him even though he can't hear that. And
mm.
I have to forgive him even though, things don't change. It's just I can't live holding on to the bitterness, to the resentment that I had for so many years.
You've been blessed to have children because of things that maybe were a void in your life. You can somehow fill those voids in by being the father that maybe you wish you had.
Mm.